Good day. We are the Group 5 and our topic is about the Office of the President and Office of the Vice President confidential funds. So, first off, let us define what is confidential funds. So, confidential funds are funds commonly used by law enforcement agencies to conduct surveillance and intelligence gathering operations. So, these funds are not subjected to standard auditing rules because they are supposedly linked to sensitive national security matters. So, what are the possible security matters that these funds are being used to? So, there are three types of law enforcement undercover operations where this confidential fund is being used. The first one is investigative expenses. Uh, Confidential investigative expenses are for the purchase of service and would include the travel or transportation of an undercover officer or an informant. So, who are the people involved in this issue? So, the people involved are subdivided into two or three sections. So, the perpetrators, collaborators, and the victims. So, perpetrators and collaborators was united. Um, the first one is the government because, of course, they are the ones in charge in budgeting and using these funds, especially the Office of the President and the Office of the Vice President. Next one is the Commission on Audit because of course they are the ones who are auditing these funds. So they are the ones in charge in transparency. Next one is Department of Budget and Management because as we know this DBM is the ones releasing these funds. So they have fault if they have released if they have exceeded releasing funds. So, Department of the Interior and Local Government, Governance Commission for Government-Owned and Controlled Corporations. So, these two local government departments are involved because they are the ones requesting or asking from the fund. Like, ginagamit sa kanila yung fund na yun. And the next one is the victims. So, the victims is the Filipino citizens. No other than us. Because if these confidential funds are not being used in the right way, we are also suffering because these funds are from us. So if it is not being utilized properly, we are also suffering. And sadly, other Filipinos does not care about this issue because they are not aware of what is happening and what is the importance of this matter.
So, let's proceed to the information from researches. So, alam naman natin na naging issue ngayon ang confidential funds, particularly those of the offices of President Ferdinand Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte. So, mayroong opposition to the large sums in the proposed 2023 budget. So, the controversy surrounding the Office of the President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and the Office of Vice President Sara Duterte use of confidential and intelligent funds in the Philippines has flagged serious questions about transparency, legality, and accountability within the government. The allocation and expenditure of these confidential funds has become a subject of public concern, and rightfully so. So, according to Gregorio 2022 and Regolado 2023, so they have the both idea about confidential funds. So, according to the researchers, the Office of the President Marcos is asking for 4.5 billion pesos in confidential funds. Meanwhile, the Office of the President under the younger Duterte is asking for 500 million pesos in confidential funds. So, ano nga ba ang confidential funds? So, according to the researchers, a 2015 joint circular between the Commission on Audit, Department of Budget and Management, Department of the Interior and Local Government, Governance Commission for Government-Owned and Controlled Corporations, and the Department of National Defense laid down guidelines on confidential and intelligence funds. So, gumawa sila ng guidelines kung saan lang pwedeng gastusin or gamitin yung confidential funds. So, confidential funds are lump sum allocations set aside in the national budget for expenses that involve surveillance and intelligence information gathering activities. So, at its name suggests, confidential funds are for confidential expenses related to surveillance activities in civilian government agencies that are intended to support their mandate or operations. Example dito is ang ating Philippine Coast Guard kung saan sila ang nagbabantay sa ating mga karagatan. They are government task force dealing with the South China Sea. Next is, what can confidential funds be used for? So, saan natin siya pwede gamitin? So, according to the 2015 Joint Resolution, confidential funds can only be used for the following expenses. So, purchase of information necessary for the formulation and implementation of program, activities, and projects relevant to national security and peace and order. Rental of transport vehicle related to confidential activities. Rental and incidental expenses related to the maintenance of safe houses. Purchase of rental of supplies, materials, and equipment for confidential operations that cannot be done through regular procedures without compromising the information gathering activity concerned. Payment of rewards to information, illegal activities that pose a clear and present danger to agency, personnel, or property, or other facilities and resources under the agency protection, done in coordination with appropriate law enforcement agencies. So, who gets confidential funds? So, according to the research, ang pwede lang magkaroon ng confidential funds ay ang mga national government agencies, NGAs, and local governments and GOCCs can only get confidential funds. Their allocation and utilization must be carefully monitored to ensure that they are used for their intended purposes and that they do not fall into the wrong hand. So the people want Office of the President and the Office of Vice President is to provide clarity and address the concerns of the Filipino citizens.
The use of confidential funds in the Philippines has raised various moral and ethical issues over the years. These funds are allocated for sensitive or classified government activities and the concerns surrounding them. Our first moral issue is the lack of transparency. One major moral issue is the lack of transparency in how confidential funds are allocated and spent. This opacity can lead to potential misuse of funds or abuse of funds itself, raising the questions: where are they from? How are they achieved? And who shall we blame to be accountable if certain projects supported by these confidential funds lead to chaos or non-ethical results? To counter this issue, even though confidentiality is often essential for national security, the government must strike a moral balance between secrecy and the need for the transparency and accountability to prevent abuse of power. The second moral issue is the potential for corruption. The secrecy surrounding these funds can create opportunities for corruption and embezzlement. There's a risk that individuals in power could divert these funds for personal gain rather than the legitimate purpose of the government. Note that these funds are not presented or known to the public, so its secrecy creates a gap and opportunity to be stolen. Our third moral issue is the accountability and oversight. The lack of proper checks and balances in the allocation and use of confidential funds can erode trust in government institutions. Without sufficient oversight, it becomes challenging to ensure that the funds are used for their intended purposes. This issue sets the value of validity, goal, and purpose. Are the goals targeted by certain confidential funds needed and achieved, or are they just in text forms and not present in the real world? For our last moral issue, it's the ethical allocation. Determining how confidential funds are allocated raises moral questions. The government must ensure that these funds are used for activities that genuinely serve the public interest and national security rather than personal or political agendas. The need for great analyzation in terms of what the citizen really need and not their wants, and special analysis on allocated individuals whom can handle the matter in the most ethical way. For us to conclude, let us end in these lines. In addressing these moral issues, many advocates and organizations call for greater transparency, accountability, and ethical standards in the allocation and use of confidential funds to ensure they serve the best interest for the Philippines and its citizens. Thank you.
Confidential funds in the Philippines refer to discretionary funds allocated to government officials for various purposes, including sensitive and confidential activities. These funds have been subject of scrutiny and controversy in the country's political landscape. Different beliefs and opinions exist regarding the nature, use, and transparency of these funds. And here are some various beliefs and perspective on confidential funds in the Philippines. First is the support for confidential funds. In the national security and state interest, it says here that proponents for confidential funds argue that such funds are necessary to safeguard national security and protect states' interest. These funds enable government to carry out covert operation without public disclosure, which proponents believe is crucial for maintaining the effectiveness and success of these activities. So the public disclosure could potentially compromise these operations by alerting adversaries and undermining their goals. In essence, confidential funds are seen as a critical tool for governments to operate discreetly in the interest of the national security. Letter B is emergency use. Some believe that these funds can be necessary resource in emergency situation, that allowing the government to respond swiftly to crisis without delay. So they argue that flexibility is a valuable asset. Second is concern, which is the lack of accountability. Many individuals raise concern about the lack of transparency and accountability associated with confidential funds. They argue that the absence of clear guidelines and oversight mechanism can create opportunities for misuse and corruption. Without proper checks and balances,
these funds may be misappropriated for personal or unauthorized purposes, which could undermine public trust and potentially harm the state interest. So critics emphasize that need for transparency and accountability to ensure that these funds are used responsibly and in alignment with national security objective. Number 3 is criticism and confidential funds. Letter A is secrecy and corruption. So critics contend that confidential funds, due to their secretive nature and vulnerable to corruption and abuse. The absence of transparency means that these funds can be used without proper survey, potentially leading to financial misconduct. The lack of oversight and accountability, these funds for personal gain, undermining that intended national security or state interest objective. So critics emphasize that transparency is essential to prevent corruption and ensure responsible use of these funds. Letter B is constitutionality. Critics argue that confidential funds face legal challenges regarding their constitutionality because they may contrave the constitutional requirement of transparency and accountability in government spending. So these funds, by their secretive nature, can pass by the usual checks and balances that ensure government spending aligns with constitutional principles. So critics maintain that the lack of transparency and oversight associated with these funds can potentially infringe upon the fundamental principles of open and accountable government spending, raising, and constitutional concerns. Letter C is excessive and unnecessary. Critics raise concern about the size and necessity of confidential funds, often contending that they are excessively large and could be allocated more effectively to support public services, poverty alleviation, and infrastructure development. They argue that diverting such substantial resource towards covert operation or undisclosed state interests might not be the most efficient use for public funds. These critics advocate for greater transparency and more balanced allocation of resources to address pressing societal needs and public welfare.
Ensuring ethical management of confidential fund is crucial in both public and private sectors, but of course especially in public sector because they are public servants. So here are some alternative ethics solutions for handling confidential funds. Number 1 is the Full Disclosure Bill. What is Full Disclosure Bill? It is implementing a system of transparent record keeping which can be regularly audited by independent third parties, wherein public servants need to make it mandatory for all expenditures to be documented and approved by multiple parties, reducing the likelihood of misappropriation. A full disclosure bill for public servants is often proposed to promote transparency, accountability, and integrity in government. So, why do we need a full disclosure bill for public servants? A full disclosure bill for public servants is proposed to promote transparency, accountability, and integrity in government. Here are some reasons why such legislation may be needed. Number 1 is preventing corruption. Full disclosure bill requirements can help deter public officials from engaging in corrupt practices, as they are aware that their financial interests and assets are being monitored and can be scrutinized by the public. Number 2 is conflict of interest. It helps identify and address potential conflicts of interest where public servants may make decisions that benefit themselves of their associates rather than serving the public interest. Number 3 is accountability. Public servants are accountable to the citizens they serve. Full disclosure ensures that their financial interests are known, which can help citizens and oversight bodies hold them accountable for any unethical or illegal activities. So basically, overall, a full disclosure bill for public servant is aimed at upholding the principle of good governance, ethics, and the rule of law in the public sector. It helps maintain the public's confidence in government institution and reduces the risk of corruption and unethical behavior among public servants. So number 2 is the whistleblower protections. It established a robust whistleblower protection program that encourages employees to report any unethical behavior and related confidential funds without fear of retaliation. So, protecting whistleblower is important in some reason. For example, for accountability and transparency. Whistleblower plays a critical role in exposing wrongdoing, corruption, or unethical behavior within organizations, government agencies, or corporations. Protecting them encourages individuals to come forward and disclose information that may otherwise remain hidden. Whistleblower protection is vital for safeguarding the public interest, promoting accountability, and upholding ethical standards in both the public and private sectors. It encourages individuals to speak out against wrongdoings without fear of reprisal, which ultimately benefits society as a whole. So, the last one is the regular independent audit. Conduct regular independent audits of confidential funds to ensure compliance with ethical standards and legal requirements. This is the work of COA, or Commission on Audit, wherein they need the regular independent audit on public servants are a fundamental component of good governance. They help maintain accountability, transparency, and the efficient use of public resources, ultimately benefiting the public and upholding the principles of democracy and responsible government. And that ends a report for the Office of the President and the Office of the Vice President Confidential Fund. Thank you.